was no peace to be had at home, with everyone pestering her with questions. She hated having other people in her kitchen, especially her mother-in-law. But at least after tomorrow it would all be over. Her daughter, Bernie, would be a married woman, and the house would probably be so quiet that Maureen would wish they could have the wedding all over again. Yvonne would come up to the house in the morning to do Bernie and the bridesmaids, but she'd asked if she could get a literal head start on Maureen tonight. She was the only one who needed her roots done, so it was easier in the salon, with all the brushes, foil strips, bottles and toners needed. Everyone politely referred to Yvonne's as the salon, when it was clearly nothing more than a converted garage on the side of the house. In fairness, she had done a lovely job, fully tiled throughout, and it was only on the worst days of winter you might need one of the travel rugs she had on hand to offer her clients. With her ample frame wedged into the chair and her magazine resting on the soft shelf of her bosom, Maureen didn't see the young woman running up the hill. And the noise of the dryer meant she didn't hear the door to the salon being thrown open. It was only when a grim-faced Yvonne tapped her on the shoulder that she looked up to see her younger daughter, Connie, standing in front of her, all flushed in the face, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was saying something, but Maureen couldn't hear her. She wriggled free of the dryer with the help of an apologetic Yvonne. Connie's voice was a mixture of sobs and swallowed words that made no sense. Maureen struggled to her feet. "What is it? What's wrong?" Just managing to control her heaving gasps, Connie said, "Daddy says you're to come home. Oh, Mammy, the guards are at the house." She tried to say more, but her mouth was overtaken by threads of snot and spit. She collapsed into her mother's arms, her tears soaking into the pale pink towel that was still draped across Maureen's shoulders. Less than a mile away, over the bridge and in a small terrace cottage down the entry beside the hotel, Dee Hegarty laid 5 buttonholes in a line on the kitchen table. Each was a single red rosebud framed by a white shock of baby's breath. Dee was carefully wrapping them in damp tissue paper before they were to be stored in the salad drawer of the fridge overnight. As she worked, she couldn't stop smiling at the sight of her own hands. They looked like they belonged to a stranger, her nails pink and shiny like the inside of a shell. She couldn't remember the last time she had worn nail varnish, but it was a special occasion, and she didn't want David to think she wasn't excited about his big day. The buttonholes were placed head to tail, like floral sardines, in a shallow cardboard box. Dee had to admit that they had turned out very well. Red and white were the cork colours. It was about the only detail of the wedding plans that David had been involved in. He insisted on everything being in his team's colours. Bernie and her mother had finally agreed, since he allowed them to decide on everything else. Dee was trying not to worry, but despite herself, she stole a glance at the clock above the cooker. Gone 7:30. She hoped he hadn't been dragged to the pub. With all the excitement and the lovely evening, it was no surprise if that was where he had ended up. The last thing he needed tomorrow was a hangover. He might be a clever lad, a kind one, but even his own mother had to admit he seemed to lack any common sense. Not for the first time, Dee questioned the wisdom of her son walking down the aisle. He was just 23, still a boy. What was the rush? Himself and Bernie swore blind that no shotgun was involved, and her family seemed thrilled. But why wouldn't they? In a few years, he'd be a fully qualified dentist. Dee liked Bernie and the Bradleys well enough, but a doubt about this marriage still nagged at her. Could David do better? As a girlfriend, Bernie was fine, but was she really a fitting wife and mother? She was just so loud. If she hadn't been her son's girlfriend, Dee might have described her as coarse. She hated herself for having these disloyal thoughts, especially after Maureen and Frank Bradley had been so generous. Of course, it was tradition for the bride's family to pay, but people didn't really hold with that anymore. Nowadays, everyone chipped in. But, without ever embarrassing her, they had made it clear that she wouldn't be expected to contribute. After David's father died, things hadn't been easy. But she had managed. Dr. Coulter took her on as a receptionist, and the little cottage she had bought after she sold the big house, the family home out on the New Road, suited her and David fine. Her son had waved away her objections. They can well afford it, and look what they're getting.